Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1306. Our subject for this week is the long history of the civil rights movement. So in many ways we're going to be building on the back of what we've already looked at happening in the early part of the 20th century when we took a look at some black intellectuals and African Americans who fought for equality prior to World War II and post World War II, the 50s and 60s. So we looked at people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Marcus Garvey. But really, when we get to this era of the civil rights movement, this is where the movement is going to become much grander, much larger, better organized. And this is going to be a national push for equality for African Americans. So the subject for this particular week deals with civil rights as a larger movement, not simply the African American civil rights movement, but for the purposes of this video and time, that is what I'm going to be focusing on. You can look to your textbook and to the PowerPoint lecture to learn about Native American rights and Mexican American rights, which are also happening concurrently with the African American civil rights movement. But when we look at the modern civil rights movement as it really starts to pick up steam in the 1950s, we need to go back just even a little bit further to World War II, because this is going to lead to a rise in black consciousness globally. It's not something that's specific to black America. Really, with World War II, this is going to mark a critical change in black self-consciousness. African soldiers start returning back to the continent, having fought for the colonial powers, and they immediately begin challenging the European imperial regimes that had divided Africa up into a series of colonies. The first independent African nation is going to be Ghana. It's built out of the former colony of the Gold Coast, but there's a politician by the name of Kwame Nkrumah who pushes this idea of Pan-Africanism. And he's going to help back Nnamdi Azikiwe, who will be fighting throughout the 1950s to get the British out of Nigeria. But you see a very rapid process of decolonization taking place in Africa because these soldiers come back from the battlefield and they essentially say, if we're good enough to go and fight with you and we're good enough to go and die next to you fighting Nazis, fighting the Axis powers, then why is it that we're now being treated as second-class citizens in our own homes? And this is something that's going to happen in the United States as well. Black veterans return to the United States, and they basically are going to come back and say, wait a minute, I can go and die next to you in a trench over in France, but I can't sit next to a white guy and eat lunch at a lunch counter in Biloxi, Mississippi. And so what we're seeing here is that the sacrifices made by black soldiers worldwide is going to spark a major change in how they view themselves living in their own communities and their own nations when they return back home after the war. So, the real battle of the first battle of the civil rights movement begins with segregation and formal segregation in American schools. The first case that really ever challenged this took place in 1896. It went on from 1896 and a ruling was made in 1898. And this is the famous Plessy versus Ferguson case. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in America's schools was certainly legal by the merits of the Constitution, as long as the institutions that housed black students and white students were separate but equal. In reality, we can now look back and say with a fair degree of certainty that African American schools were underfunded, understaffed, under-resourced, and when you put them in comparison to white schools, they were never truly equal. They never got the same amount of public resources that white schools got. But that was at least ostensibly the basis for why segregation could be deemed legal under the Constitution in American schools. In 1954, the issue of segregation in America's schools would come up again. In this particular instance, the NAACP is going to take up the case of Oliver L. Brown. He was challenging the school board in Topeka, Kansas regarding segregation in American schools. He essentially challenged segregation in Topeka, Kansas and said, this is a violation of black Americans' constitutional rights. The case itself makes it to the Supreme Court, and in 1954, when they look at this particular case of Brown versus the Topeka, Kansas School Board, the Supreme Court would overrule the 1898 decision of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. They said that really there is no such thing as separate but equal. This doesn't exist. There's no way, but the very act of separating somebody out based on race has eliminated the possibility of equality. And so that is why the Supreme Court is going to shoot down segregation in American schools. After this ruling, the significance of this ruling is that American schools are going to be forced to abandon segregation as an official policy, and they're going to be forced to integrate into the same schools as white Americans. And so that's the major outcome of the of the Brown versus Topeka ruling here in 1954. So this is going to be significant mostly in the American South. What you'll tend to see is that in the North, segregation does exist, but it's not legal segregation. It's not segregation that's been written out in the rule books and put into practice as a legal institution. In the North, it's more what they call informal or de facto segregation. African Americans didn't go to the same schools as whites up north, but that's not because on paper there's a rule that says they can't. It's because schools are zoned by district, and in the North, they're practicing racist policies that don't allow African Americans to live in the same neighborhoods as whites. Therefore, they wouldn't be going to the same schools. In the South, the communities as they live are much more integrated, but their institutions are officially and legally segregated. So the fight for segregation is really going to take shape in the American South. And it's also important to remember when we look at this ruling of Brown versus Topeka in 1954, what has happened here is that the Supreme Court said you're no longer allowed to segregate based on race in your schools. But that doesn't necessarily, just ordaining something a new law doesn't necessarily make minds and hearts change on the ground. There will be a lot of blowback, and the fight over integration and segregation in American schools in the South is going to remain a rather heated subject throughout the civil rights movement. So, the next episode of the civil rights movement that we need to take a look at is a particularly disturbing case, and that is the case of Emmett Till in 1955. Emmett Till's case is one that really, over the years, has been challenged. It's been looked at and revised as to how we saw the facts of this particular case. And really, really recently, I'd say within the last, if my memory serves, 3 to 4 years, there was a bombshell revelation about Emmett Till's case that really changed the way that we as historians, and I think as people and society at large, need to look at this instance. But the Emmett Till case begins with a boy named Emmett Till, who's 14 years old. He's from Chicago, Illinois, but he has family down in Mississippi, and he travels down there to visit this family in 1955. Before he leaves, his mother does warn him. She says, look, things aren't great here in Chicago as it comes to racial relations and racial disparities, but you don't understand, Emmett. Things in Mississippi are a lot different than they are in Chicago, Illinois. And the white people in Mississippi are quite a bit different than the type you've encountered up north. And so she gives him those warnings and tells him to be careful. Now here is where the story gets murky in terms of details. And really when I say murky, I'd say they've shifted a lot over the years. This was the story even back when I was going to school that was told. One of Till's cousins basically dared him to walk into a general store in a town called Money, Missouri, and basically go up and hit on a white woman. That was the story. And so the story then goes that this is exactly what Till did. He walks into this general store and he grabs a woman by the arm and asks her out on the date. His terrified cousin then comes running into the store and drags him away. Now, that's the story. Recently, the woman who is at the center of it, the one who worked in the store that he supposedly hit on or asked out for a date, she on her deathbed admitted that he never did this. He never made any gestures towards her. He never said anything to her, that there was really no basis for the attack that would later come on Emmett Till. So for decades, the understanding was that Emmett Till acted a little boldly and didn't understand the environment that he was in. And the reality is that wasn't even the case. He was blindly and maliciously attacked by this woman's husband and her brother. 2 days later, they come to the home of Emmett Till's relatives, and they drag him out in the middle of the night. They drive him out to an abandoned plantation where they beat him mercilessly. As painful as it is to look at, I put an image on the slide, not just for simply shock value or to show what was going on, but because this image that I put there on the slide was run across newspapers all throughout the United States. And for many, many Americans, it drove the reality of life for African Americans in the American South home. It was something that a lot of people in the North didn't realize, that segregation, that racial hatred and animosity in the American South and racial violence in the American South had reached this epidemic level that it had. But after Emmett Till was beaten, they drove him to a river, they shot him in the head, and they dumped his body in that river. Now, again, I put the picture up on the slide. I know it's disturbing, very, very shocking, but his family pressed for prosecution. And this is something that in the American South was unusual. If a black person went missing, particularly a black male, there wasn't an investigation. There wasn't a prosecution. Nobody really asked for answers as to why it happened. And the sad part is that even African American communities in the South, they didn't need to ask what happened. They knew. If you want to find them, go start dredging the swamps and the rivers and the lagoons, because that's where their body is at. But the family pushes for prosecution, unfortunately, because Till's murderers are going in front of an all-white jury in the American South, all white males. They are not going to be prosecuted. They're going to be let off the hook. And this is going to be a recurring theme that I really want you to take away from what we talk about in the civil rights movement. It's not about whether or not the specific goal of any particular civil rights action was met. What the entire push of the civil rights movement was to draw attention to these types of cases. It was to get more people across the nation to get their eyes opened up as to what's going on here in the United States as it came to racial relations. And the reason that Emmett Till's mother wanted this image of him published was so that Americans could see what happened to her child. They could see what was really happening in the American South. And so this, if you're looking at it in that perspective, the significance of this case is that it has that impact. Many, many people are shocked and appalled by the imagery that I've posted up here, and rightfully so. And that shock is going to push them into action. It's going to push the civil rights movement forward. In a lot of ways, the Emmett Till case shakes a lot of Americans out of their complacency. When they see an image like this, you can't just put the blinders on and pretend this isn't going on. This will really jerk you out of that state of complacency. And so the fact that Emmett Till's mother pushed for these images to be shared in publications across the United States had an incredible impact on the overall trajectory of the civil rights movement. So the next instance that we're going to look at here is the Montgomery bus boycott. This happened in 1955 and 1956, and this is the incident that's going to make Rosa Parks a very, very central figure of the civil rights movement. In December of 1955, an African-American woman named Rosa Parks challenged segregation that was being practiced in the Montgomery bus system in Alabama. She refuses to give up her seat to a white man, and this would have been the common practice at the time on the segregated bus lines. Parks was subsequently arrested and booked in the Montgomery County Jail. Ostensibly, I believe her charges were for disturbing the peace. So, the growing civil rights movement that's starting to become a little more formalized at this time, they take notice of Parks's case. And a new leader in the civil rights movement was going to step forward in trying to address the Montgomery bus system and to lead this boycott. And that's a guy named Martin Luther King Jr. His overarching theory about how racial equality would be achieved in the United States is modeled after that of Mahatma Gandhi, who had just recently succeeded in driving the British out of India using passive resistance or nonviolent resistance. He challenged the British imperial regime there. Well, Martin Luther King Jr. looks at that message and says that would work for African Americans here in the United States. If somebody spits it at you, you smile back at them. If somebody slaps you, you turn the other cheek. Even though you have grievances, even though you have problems, The way that you address those problems is through non-violent resistance. You don't pick up arms and fight back. You actually work within the system, and you accept a lot of what is the negative and unfair sorts of treatment that you're getting, but you fight nonetheless. You draw attention to these problems. You don't go out and fight with fists, with weapons. You simply fight with your voice. You fight with your ability and your right to protest in the United States. And so he takes that model from Gandhi and he's going to be applying it here to the American civil rights movement. So, African Americans, roughly 40,000 of them live in the city of Montgomery, and the majority of them pay 20 cents a day to ride the bus lines. They are going to boycott the bus lines. They refuse to ride the buses, and they demand that there be first come, first served seating policies put into place on the buses. They want better treatment from the bus drivers who were routinely racist towards African American riders, and they want to hire more African American drivers. And that's what they're pushing for here. And until these demands are met, African Americans in the city of Montgomery refuse to ride the bus lines. And that is a big, big, big economic impact on the profitability of these bus systems. So the bus service initially refused all of these changes and amendments. But there was something called the Montgomery Improvement Association. This was an organization that was designed to help African Americans keep going while the boycott was happening. Pickup points started to get formed all around the city. Those in turn became the site of terrorist bombings from white supremacists. And so what you're seeing is that the bus pickup points and these carpool pickup points become basically like a war zone on the front lines of the civil rights movement. But what happens here is that the bus line in Montgomery basically calls the bluff of the protesters. They say, African Americans don't have the luxury to stand around not working and protesting in the streets. They don't have the luxury to boycott our bus lines. They need us. They don't have cars. At which point the Montgomery Improvement Association says, nah, they don't need you. We'll find other ways to get them to and from work, to get people moving around the city. And that's going to sustain the protesters to where they don't have to bend to the bus lines. So after a year of protests, this boycott was a smashing success. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation within buses was unconstitutional, just as they had in the schools earlier in Topeka, Kansas. After coming to prominence in these bus boycotts, Martin Luther King Jr. would form what's known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This would put African American churches at the epicenter of the civil rights movement. The Christian identity of the civil rights movement is going to be a recurring theme in the early years. Most of the grassroots organization of the civil rights movement is happening within black churches. These are the epicenters of the civil rights movement when it starts forming. And that's because a lot of the leaders, people like Martin Luther King Jr., are affiliated with religious organizations. So, and also the message of his push for African American equality, nonviolent resistance, and basically passive resistance, and fighting for racial equality with your voice rather than your fists. This is a message that syncs up well with a lot of tenets of Christianity, and so they kind of go together hand in hand. So that's how we see the church becoming a major part of the civil rights movement. So the next case that we need to look at is going to happen in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. And that is the case of the Little Rock Nine. Despite the fact that segregation had been overturned in the Brown versus the Board of Education case, American schools in the South were very, very slow to integrate. Schools are largely, as I mentioned, they're organized around your local community. So because the communities are segregated, the schools still remain segregated because of racial inequalities in the housing markets. Furthermore, in the South, segregationists were firm in their beliefs, and this leads to little change on the local level. In other words, a bunch of people in robes up in Washington, D.C. can say whatever they want, but that doesn't change the mind of the parents who are sending their kids to the school. They're still going to fight against segregation, for segregation and against integration. And the epicenter of this fight is going to take place at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. They decided that they needed to force integration, that they couldn't wait for it to happen organically. They figured if they did, it probably would never occur. And so they decide that at the beginning of the 1957 school year, they're going to invite 9 African American students to join Central High School. Segregationists show up these students trying to enter the school, and they actually start turning to terrorist tactics to intimidate African Americans. They're going to start sending them death threats. They're going to start threatening their families. They're going to throw rocks through the windows of their homes. Burning crosses are being set all around Little Rock, Arkansas by Klan members. Really what we're seeing here is that there is a huge public fight over the integration of schools taking place here in Little Rock. The Little Rock Nine draw national attention. When the federal government has to send in the military, they have to send in federal military to force integration because the governor of the state of Arkansas, a guy by the name of Orval Faubus, he actually stands in front of Central High School's door and blocks entry for the Little Rock Nine. He doesn't allow them to enter Central High School. He refuses to acknowledge the federal court's ruling on integrating the schools. And because of this, what happens is the civil rights movement takes a distinct turn here. It's going to start to become a fight between southern states who are saying it's our state rights to decide what to do on racial integration and equality, and the federal government who is trying to make legislation that forces the South to overturn these Jim Crow segregationist policies. And so the Little Rock Nine is going to be a major, major point because what happens here is the civil rights movement makes this big shift. It shifts from being isolated incidents that have to do with with a bus line or a school, and it makes it a states versus federal rights issue. And that's something that's going to remain a common theme throughout the rest of the civil rights movement. Now, I'm going to briefly diverge from pointing out the actual events that are pushing the civil rights movement forward to talk about a more general tactic that's being used to fight racial segregation in the United States. See, what happens here is it's easy for the federal government and the Supreme Court to say, a school is a public institution that gets federal funds, that gets money from our government. Therefore, we can make a rule that says you can't have segregated schools anymore. And then you have this other element with the bus lines. Those have public subsidies. They're getting taxpayer dollars to run. So again, the government can step in and say, no, you can't have segregation there. That's illegal. Now, there's something else going on in the United States, and that's segregation in privately owned businesses. The government cannot at this point step in, or at least there's nothing on the books that says they can step in and tell a business owner that he has to accept black customers, that he has to treat people of different races equally in his business. That legislation has not been passed yet. And so in order to start attacking private businesses that practice segregation, civil rights leaders start organizing what are known as sit-ins. This is a tactic for fighting racial oppression in private businesses and white-only businesses. The fight over segregation moves from government-run institutions to challenging the policies of individual business owners. Really where these tend to take place are at diners and restaurants. That's the main focus because this is really important. We take this for granted now. Today, if you're really desperate at 2:30 in the morning, you don't have any food in the fridge, you can go to a McDonald's. You can go to a drive-thru, a Burger King, a Wendy's. It doesn't matter. We have restaurants on every corner. Here in Houston, you can't spit without hitting a restaurant. But what's going to happen, back in these days, you have people working long hours. If they didn't have food ready in the fridge when they got back home, they had no other place to eat than one local diner in town. And if that's a whites-only diner, then African Americans had no place to go get something to eat. And so they start focusing on these diners and these restaurants as places to challenge this racial segregation. What they do is it's right in line with the nonviolent resistance method. They come in, they sit down, and they order something to eat. Now, everybody in that business and the people who are ordering something to eat and challenging this, they all know this is a whites-only business, that they're not going to be served. But they do it and they're putting themselves at a great deal of risk. Angry mobs are forming around people. Drinks are being dumped on their head. Food's being thrown in their face. They're getting spit on. They're getting yelled at. They're getting hit. But they go and they sit there calmly, and all they do is say, I just came in to get a bite to eat. I just wanted to grab a bite to eat. And what this does is it really shifts how people are viewing the dynamics of what are going on here. You start, especially in the North, where segregation is not as entrenched. Generally, what's happening is people are turning on their TVs and they're seeing mobs of white people attack black people who are just sitting at a lunch counter. And for what? All they did was ask for something to eat. They just wanted a bite to eat. And so what it really does is it shows you that who are the people we should really be fearing in this nation? Is it the virulent, angry mob that's spitting vitriol towards these poor African Americans who just sat there at a counter and wanted to get something to eat? And it really, these sit-ins have the effect of flipping the narrative on its head. Because the narrative in white America at this point is that African Americans are dangerous and need to be kept out of white America. And what this does, it shows people, who are we really worrying about and why? When I look at an image like that, I don't see a violent, angry black guy. I see a bunch of violent, angry white people attacking him, and I see him sitting there trying to get some lunch. In one way, this humanizes African Americans for a lot of whites, and in another way, it dehumanizes the whites who are pushing for segregation. So the sit-ins have a wide-reaching impact, and they help African Americans challenge segregation in privately owned businesses. That's the significance of the sit-ins as a tactic throughout the civil rights movement. So, moving on, we see that in addition to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that was formed by Martin Luther King Jr., there is another end of the civil rights movement that takes shape early on, and that is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was founded by a woman named Diane Nash in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1960. The group was formed to get a crucial partnership going with the SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference. At this point, that's the main body of the civil rights movement, the SCLC. So I apologize in advance. There are a lot of acronyms in the civil rights era. It's nothing I can avoid. We got to use them. But the SCLC is going to be sort of the brains behind the organization. They decide, where are we going to go? What are we going to challenge? Who are we going to boycott? What protests are we going to stage next? But these are older people. These are middle-aged and older people who have some life experience, and they're not necessarily the best people to have on the front lines of a protest or a sit-in. They're going to look to students, young people. They want youth to get involved in this movement. And what they're ultimately going to do is the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is going to be the front line of the protest. These are the people you see out in the streets marching, holding signs, sitting at those lunch counters. The SNCC was critical to the civil rights movement. It is significant because we know as a general trend, and I don't want to impugn anybody's decision-making ability. I'll just say I'll speak to my own experience. I was a lot dumber and a lot braver when I was younger. I didn't think as much about, and I didn't have a wife, I didn't have a kid, I didn't have a house, I didn't have a car, I didn't have all these things that I have to, a job and a career. You have a lot less to lose. And so I'm far more likely to get out on the front lines and put my head in front of a baton. I'm far more likely to get out there in front of a fire hose, in front of police dogs, and stand up for what I believe in. Students and the youth of the civil rights movement, they form the energy. They form the push. They are the ones that are out there in the streets actually marching. Whereas the SCLC steps back and allows them to take that role while they do more of the organizational end of things. Guys like Martin Luther King Jr., they will all end up as the major leaders of the civil rights movement. They're all going to end up in jail at one point or another. But they have a lot more to lose if they're jailed indefinitely or for any long period of time. They have families to support. They have things they need to do. You also don't, it's kind of like looking at something from a military perspective. You generally don't send your highest rank military officer right out into the front lines of a battlefield. You don't want Martin Luther King Jr. being incapacitated in this fight because he's really sort of the one driving it forward. So That's the importance and the significance of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, as I'll be referring to them from here on out. So, in the early 1960s, there is a shift in the Supreme Court that is going to lead to a spate of critical legislation that pushes the civil rights movement really forward, but also almost towards its ends of achieving the kind of federal laws that they wanted to see. During JFK's presidency, that's Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, for those of you who might not know, he's president between 61 and 63. The Supreme Court would quickly become the sort of deciding factor in the civil rights era. They become decidedly more liberal under JFK, and it will continue to be more liberal after his assassination. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time was Justice Earl Warren. He held that position all the way back from 1953, and he held it up till 1969. So he's really on it throughout the better part of the civil rights movement. He believes strongly in protecting individuals' rights. He believes that his interpretation of the Constitution led him to believe that it is the federal government's responsibility to protect the most vulnerable Americans. Going back to what we've learned in the semester so far, he is a very progressive Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Under his watch, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of various civil rights causes, but they also pushed an agenda that protected personal privacy. It's during this time that the Supreme Court overturned state laws that limited adults' access to what they called obscene material. I'll cut through the red tape here and just tell you that porn. Porn became widely more available in the 1960s thanks to the rulings of the Supreme Court. There were a lot of state laws that, especially in the southern states, which were decidedly more religious. There were rules against the sale and usage of contraception, condoms, birth control, things like that. Those were overturned. Interracial marriage bans that were existent all throughout the American South were overturned by Chief Justice Earl Warren's Supreme Court during this time period. They also refined how police operated, and they placed limitations on interrogation tactics. And it's at this time that we get our Miranda laws, where citizens need to be informed of the charges they were facing at the time of their arrest. So you can see a much more liberal and progressive ideology coming out of the court at this time. Because of that, it will be possible to pass some of the really critical pieces of civil rights legislation that are going to come out of the 1960s. And that's going to all be sort of debated by the Supreme Court of Chief Justice Earl Warren. So, spoiler alert, Kennedy's not going to be here for very long. Kennedy gets assassinated in Dallas. And that means that his Texan vice president, a guy by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson, is going to be stepping into the role of president. Now, Johnson was critical in moving the liberal agenda forward as a congressman first, and then as a vice president, and eventually a president. He comes up with something known as his Great Society Plan. Generally, what the Great Society Plan is designed to do, it's supposed to be like a second New Deal. He's pushing for a number of social welfare reforms that would make the modern amenities that Americans are living with, things like electricity, running water, quality public education, public health care, all of these things, he wants to make them widely available to each and every American citizen. And it's under his Great Society Plan that we're going to see some great deal of pieces of civil rights legislation be passed. Now, what's important to understand about the Great Society Plan is that it's not entirely about African American civil rights or about their equality in the United States, but he passes a bunch of legislation that's made to help all Americans, but mostly the people who are living in the lowest conditions, people who are living in the greatest degrees of poverty, people who have the least amount of resources. And because of racial bias and racism in the systemic racism in the United States, that's generally going to be helping African Americans more than it is any other demographic of Americans. But he passes a lot of legislation here. All of these acts together are utilized to further African American access to a modern standard of living in the United States. while also helping the poorest segments of American society, regardless of their race and ethnicity. He's going to revise the Social Security Act in 1965. He passes the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which opens greater access and more funding to public education. The Higher Education Act seeks to deal with disparities at the university level and open up more funding for African Americans to go to school. The Immigration Act of 1965 is going to help make life easier for people coming in from abroad. So, all of these things are going to be major shifts in American society. Now, there is some speculation, or at least argument amongst historians, that a lot of Johnson's more liberal elements weren't really able to be passed. A lot of people look at his Great Society plan and say he didn't achieve what he wanted to achieve. And that's largely because much of the Democratic Party, even in the 1960s, is still dominated by Southern Democrats who do not believe in racial equality. And so he has a hard time getting past this segment of his own party to get legislation passed. In fact, on many occasions, he's more successful working with Republicans than he is with working within his own party and the Democrats, because he has such a strong racial element to the Southern Democrats. So, there is also something that's going to be different here in this civil rights movement. It's sort of what makes it very different from other things we've seen in the past in American history, and that is the spread and popularity of television. The civil rights movement was televised, and it's one of the few events if you remember back to when we were talking about the Vietnam War, it was important in Vietnam as well. It's one thing to pick up a newspaper and read statistics. It's another thing to turn on a TV set and see in live action right there what is happening in the world and in your nation. And so when people are turning on their TV, again, you have to understand in the North, people aren't fully aware of the level of racial animosity as it occurred in the American South. And so when they're able to turn on their TVs and these images are being beamed right into them, again, this has the effect of shocking Americans out of their state of complacency and wanting to support the civil rights movement. I am trying to keep this short, but I do want to point out that I'm not going to talk too much about the Freedom Riders or the Freedom Summer, but that's a very big event in the civil rights movement that you're going to want to take a look at because it's going to ultimately introduce a couple of new people that will become long-standing advocates for African American equality and rights in the United States, most notably of whom we have Representative John Lewis, who just recently died. He has been I'm not used to him being dead, a lifelong advocate for civil rights, and he got his start in the Freedom Summer, pushing in the Freedom Rides. So I invite you to take a look at that on your own. There's, unfortunately, just to keep the video as short as I can, some stuff I have to kind of eliminate and cut out. But Birmingham, Alabama is going to become the sort of national focus of the civil rights movement in 1963, because Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, again, are going to organize another campaign. And this one is known as the Birmingham Campaign. They started in April of 1963. This campaign was an organization of marches, boycotts, and sit-ins of all the segregationist businesses in Birmingham, Alabama. So the state, they had caught wind, the government of Alabama had caught wind of this protest coming. And they said up front, they passed a law that said, we are now outlawing all public demonstrations of any kind, because they did not want what happened in the previous bus boycotts and what's happening in other parts of the American South, where national attention is being drawn to parts of the American South. They don't want that kind of publicity, so they just said, you're not allowed to have public demonstrations, thinking that that's going to stop the protests. King shows up in Birmingham, and he's immediately arrested. And that's where he pens his very famous letter, a letter from a Birmingham jail. And he writes it on the margins of newspaper and scraps of toilet paper that he has in his cell. But this is going to become one of the foundational writings of Martin Luther King Jr., where we can really see his ideology on full display. The public marches are going to continue after Martin Luther King Jr. is released from jail. And that is going to bring all the businesses in downtown Birmingham to an absolute standstill. Nobody is making money in Birmingham, Alabama now. The boycott and the marches and the protests were very, very successful. The SCLC actively goes around recruiting high school students in this area to shore up the number of protesters and supporters they have out in the streets. In response to these large public gatherings, the Birmingham police are going to resort to intimidation and brutal tactics to try and stop the marchers. They sick police dogs on the protesters. They spray them with pepper spray and fire hoses. They're beating them with batons. Basically, if you think to the imagery that generally pops into your mind with the civil rights movement, you're generally thinking about what's happening in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. That's where a lot of those images come from. Northerners are flipping on their TV sets and watching this, and they're disgusted by the police brutality that they see. Even Southern moderates are starting to come around and go, look, this is out of hand. And the police chief in Birmingham is a guy, he's got the perfect Southern racist police chief name. His name is Bull Connor. Bull Connor is using these heavy-handed tactics. And even Southern moderates, Southern Democrats who are against integration, they go, look, you're going to bring the feds down here. They're going to send in the military like they did in Little Rock back in '57, and we don't want that. They really want to avoid that. So they start actually pressuring Connor to give up these heavy-handed tactics. They start easing up on the protesters. And ultimately, the Birmingham campaign becomes a major smashing success. It does exactly what it set out to do. Number one, it draws national attention to racial inequality in the Deep South. Number two, it desegregates the restaurants and diners in the city. Three, it leads to greater job creation for African Americans in the city of Birmingham. And four, it renews President Kennedy's interests in the civil rights movement. Kennedy, up in the first few years of his presidency, he was plagued by rumors that he was soft on communism. So his main point was to focus on what's going on abroad and stopping the spread of communism. Birmingham and the incidents that are happening there in 1963, they forced Kennedy to turn back and start recommitting to the civil rights movement and civil rights causes. So the assassination of Medgar Evers, I always get his name wrong, is another important sort of event, and it's a high-profile assassination of a major African-American civil rights leader. Medgar Evers is the head of the NAACP. And he is really trying to fight for desegregation in the American South. He actually is trying to sort of get the attention of the federal government, and he wants to bring everybody's attention back to what's happening here in the American South. And he is going to capitalize on the fact that Kennedy steps up in early 1963, and he says, we need a wide-sweeping federal civil rights act that would desegregate every public institution in the United States. Evers is coming from a meeting in which they're talking about Kennedy's announcement. And a Klansman by the name, a guy who's part of the Ku Klux Klan, his name is Byron De La Beckwith, targeted Medgar Evers. Hours after meeting with other NAACP leaders, Evers pulls into the driveway of his home in Jackson, Mississippi. As he's getting out of the car, he's wearing a Jim Crow Must Go t-shirt. Evers gets shot in the back by De La Beckwith. His assassination further shocks an already unsettled nation. There's protests going on all over the South. Everything is starting to shift in American society. The Vietnam War is starting to really take its toll on the American psyche. And so this event really freaks people out. It sets off, it's sort of like a powder keg that sets off other civil rights events. So Evers' funeral was attended by all of the major leaders of the civil rights movement. De La Beckwith is brought up on charges in the 1960s, but his cases, they keep coming back up before a jury, and it always ends in a hung jury. He's never actually convicted. Again, we're still at a point where the courts are not integrated at this point. The juries are not integrated. So he keeps getting exonerated by all white juries. He was ultimately retried again in 1994 when he was convicted. Unfortunately, he got to go on and live the rest of his life. He dies after spending 7 years in prison in 2001. Medgar Evers is going to die when he's shot in Mississippi, but there's no justice for him. Dela Beckwith will continue to live a whole, long, happy life until he's eventually thrown back in jail. So, the next major event that's going to occur trying to get the passage of the Civil Rights Act is going to be the March on Washington in August of 1963. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech. This is where that speech comes from. The March on Washington is all about demanding equality. It's all about demanding that people have the same opportunities. But what they're really trying to do here is they're trying to push for jobs and freedom. Those are the two slogans of this March on Washington. But you have tons and tons and tons of people converging on the Washington Monument. This is important because what's happening here is this is going to bring a lot of attention to what's going on in the United States. Remember, the United States is fighting against communism abroad. And the reason for it is that communism denies people their freedoms. It denies people their rights. It denies them their right to choose. And then African Americans are marching on Washington right here in the midst of the Cold War going, that's how we live here in the United States, guys. That's how we suffer every day, and we're citizens of this nation. So it undermines the American position that they're fighting for democracy, that they're fighting for freedom, that they're out there fighting for justice and peace around the world when they're keeping a segment of their own population oppressed. And so you start to see demonstrations happen all over the world after this big protest. It really embarrasses the federal government in a lot of ways. And it's going to force them to really address what's going on in the United States with a Civil Rights Act. And there is one more event that is going to really push that whole thing forward, and that is the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, where Klansmen are going to pick a day that is known as Youth Day within the church, and they set explosives all around the 16th Street Baptist Church, which had been really well known in the civil rights community. It was a major organizational point for the grassroots civil rights movement there. And the 16th Street Baptist Church is in Birmingham, Alabama, but it would be bombed on September 15th, 1963. It ended up killing 10 young people and injuring 22 more. And this is one of those things where even other racists and pro-segregation advocates looked at this and they go, ugh, that's disgusting. That you would kill children. This is jarring. This is something that absolutely shocks the United States. And when you put that in conjunction with the Freedom Summer, where you have a number of advocates go missing, in the American South, Northerners who had come down, to fight for African American equality in the South. All of this is going to culminate in forcing the federal government's hand to pass a wide sweeping Civil Rights Act, and that will happen in 1964. This is the most critical piece of legislation in the era of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 happened when Congress was coming under increasing pressure from LBJ, when you have the Freedom Summer going on, where you have these white activists being searched for in the South who have gone missing. Everybody knows they're dead. But the FBI has now gotten involved. They're looking for them. In addition to that, you have the March on Washington embarrassing the United States earlier in the year. You have the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And so under all this pressure, Congress will finally adopt the much-needed Civil Rights Act. This bill is critically important. This is the bill that bans segregation in businesses and any place that is open to the public in the United States. It prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, or sex. And so really, when we talk about the equality in the United States, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is what essentially protects and guarantees it. It's what says it doesn't matter if you're a gay person who walks into a bakery and they don't like what your lifestyle, they still have to bake you a cake because they're a public business and they bake it for a straight couple. It's the thing that says an employer can't go, I'm not going to hire this individual because they're black. I'm not going to hire this individual because they're a woman. All of these things are now illegal in the United States. And this is huge because the federal government is passing this legislation and it has to be followed by any private business in the United States. And so that takes care of that issue where the federal government has been trying to piecemeal dismantle segregation in these publicly funded institutions. Now, the federal government has said nobody gets to be discriminatory, nobody gets to be a racist here in the United States. And that's what the act is all about. On paper, and even up to this day, this is a critically important act. I don't want you to think that it's not important, but you do have to remember laws don't always translate into action. It's incredibly difficult. If I were to be a guy who's hiring someone, and let's say I have a white candidate and a black candidate, they're both equally qualified, and I choose to give the job to the white candidate. How do you prove, unless I blatantly say, I gave it to him because I'm a racist and I don't like African Americans? If you can't, there's no way to prove that. Unless I openly say it, I haven't really run afoul of the Civil Rights Act. I could say, I thought he was a better fit for our company. Or I thought that he had a little bit more pointed work experience that would have made him a better candidate. It's hard to prove personal motivation and bias. And that's what the Civil Rights Act kind of requires people to do. And so it's still not just going to create an immediate level playing field for everybody. It doesn't change, as I'm sure you're all well aware, because these conversations are still ongoing in the United States. But what you tend to see happen here now is that people are going to still violate this act, but it now is on paper and people are going to start running afoul of it and being tried for it when they're being blatantly racist, blatantly misogynistic, blatantly homophobic. And so it does give us that baseline from which we can say, it's hard to prove all the time, but if I can prove it, you have now run afoul of the laws of the United States of America. While this act is a step in the right direction, the violence that had marred the Freedom Summer with the Baptist church bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church, it leads to more SNCC and core members arming themselves, and it's going to cause a lot more African American civil rights groups to resent the media's focus on white civil rights activists. So the reason I point this out is it's around the time that this legislation is being passed, we start to see fractures in the civil rights movement. Up until this point, it had been whites and African Americans working together. And at this point, African Americans are going to say, after the Freedom Summer, the real significance of the Freedom Summer was, and I know I glossed over it here in the video, but it's covered in your PowerPoint and in the textbook. What happens there is that African Americans are disgusted by the response. They go, wait a minute. When you go and dredge up a swamp in the American South to find a couple of white boys who went missing from New York, you find 15 African American bodies, and there was no investigation. Nobody was looking for them. Where was the FBI? Where was the national news cameras? Where was all of this national attention when black people are getting indiscriminately killed? Where is it then? And you start to see the sense of they no longer really want to work. They get resentful of the fact that a dead white person seems to be worth more than a dead black person in the overall scope of the national psyche. When the media looks at it, they cover the dead white body more than they do the dead black body. And when African Americans see this, a lot of them start to go, I don't think we should be working with whites anymore. And it's not any just open racial animosity. It's that the attention's now being paid. The whole point is that we're supposed to be showing people that our lives are worth something too, and all the focus is on it when a white person loses their life. So you see a racial fracturing starting to happen within the civil rights movement. You also see an age-based fracturing. The older members of the civil rights movement, they stick with this idea of turn the other cheek, be the bigger man, be better than your opponent that you're fighting against. And then you will ultimately succeed. The younger movement looks at the violence. The younger end of the movement breaks away from that ideology. They look at what's going on and they say, we keep talking about how we want this and we want that, and equality and equal rights. individual rights, civil rights, whatever you want to call it. We talk, and meanwhile, black people are still getting killed. People are still dying out there in the streets. They're still being beaten by police. They're still getting murdered. What are we going to do about it? Because nonviolence doesn't seem to be working, and they're going to start shifting towards a different approach. And we're going to take a look at what that looks like when we move a little bit deeper into this lecture. But to spoil it for you, they're going to start turning towards the likes of Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, and the Black Panther Party. They're going to start arguing for black separatism, saying that we can no longer live peacefully alongside white Americans. So the next major event that's going to happen will take place in 1965 in a town called Selma, Alabama. The nonviolent approach to the civil rights movement is going to score one more victory before we really start to see a major breakdown. On March 7th, 1965, 600 protesters planned a march from Selma to Montgomery, which is Alabama's capital. As they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge over the Alabama River, county police waited on the other side with batons, tear gas, fire hoses, and attack dogs. The marchers that are coming across this bridge, they kneel down for a prayer once they reach the other side, and the sheriff of Selma is going to essentially sick a bunch of police officers on these guys. And so what's happening here is that they are going to just start attacking these people while they're kneeling down and praying. And the event now is called Bloody Sunday. So white spectators from this small town in Alabama are standing there cheering on the police as they commit these acts of brutality on the protesters. Well, what's also happening is that ABC News is going to interrupt a film that they were showing on the Nuremberg trial. The Nuremberg trials are all about convicting Nazi war criminals from World War II. And so they're showing this special on the Nuremberg trials, and they're showing the Nazis goose-stepping in military uniforms, rounding up Jews and throwing them into gas chambers and sending them off to concentration camps, doing all these horrific things. And then all of a sudden they cut to a real-life news feed, and you see uniformed police officers in Selma, Alabama, man, it's tongue twisting me. Alabama, doing what looks very, very similar to African American citizens here in the United States in the 1960s. And so this juxtaposition where Americans are watching TV and they're watching a bunch of Nazis commit atrocities, then it switches over to real life and they're seeing American police commit these same kind of atrocities. It really sticks with Americans. It drives this point home. It goes, wow, we need to do something about what's happening here. A week later, a larger group of protesters is going to return to Selma and successfully complete their march across the bridge. But the significance of what happens in Selma is that it's going to lead to another key piece of legislation from the Civil Rights era, and that is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When the protesters reach Montgomery for the second time, King stands on the steps of the Capitol building and he delivers a speech in which he says, he recognizes the fracturing that's already going on. He says, I know you're asking me today, how long will it take? Well, how long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. What he's trying to do when he says this is he's trying to keep the dissatisfied ends of the civil rights movement as part of his group. He's trying to keep them focused on nonviolent resistance. He's trying to keep them focused because he knows that there are problems occurring within the movement, within the organizations. And so he is going to basically start talking then about voting rights, and that becomes the next order of the day. 5 months later, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had been discussing the civil rights movement with King in the early part of Johnson's presidency, he and King worked hand in hand on a lot of legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act that I'm about to tell you about. They signed the Voting Rights Act into law in 1965. This act prohibits literacy tests and poll taxes that were in order to vote. These are what were being used in the American South to stop African Americans from voting. The literacy test, let me tell you, I have a PhD in the humanities. I couldn't pass one of these things. The way that they're worded are so confusing. So it's not about are you literate enough to be able to cast an educated vote. That's what they said they were doing with these literacy tests. but they're impossible. Even the most a Harvard grad couldn't pass one of these things. And so it's really just there to keep African Americans from voting, as are the poll taxes, where they charge people a tax to be able to go in and vote. So what they're doing is they're going, in addition, with the Voting Rights Act, they ban these two practices. And then they say that from now on, states don't necessarily run every aspect of elections and voting anymore. They establish federal registration for voting, and they're going to start to use federal oversight in local elections. In other words, federal auditors can come in and make sure you're running a free and fair election in which all citizens are able to vote free of interference. So this was designed to avoid having state workers, especially in states where they refuse to acknowledge the 15th Amendment, which grants everybody, every citizen, their voting rights. They're going to have federal government workers overseeing state workers so they can't ignore this federal act in Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana in the Deep South. A nice little shift in fortune here. Over 9,000 African Americans in Dallas County, Alabama, had registered to vote. You might be thinking, why do we care? That is the county in Alabama in which Sheriff Jim Clark, the guy who attacked the Selma protesters, was running for re-election. And because of the increased African American vote and turnout there, he lost his re-election campaign. And so there at least was a little bit of karmic justice going on with that one there. So now the last thing I'm going to address today is the fracturing of the civil rights movement. As I mentioned, it already started back in the sort of the early to mid 1960s. Well, MLK Jr. is fighting for the benefits of nonviolent resistance to achieve racial equality. The rising violence directed at civil rights figures and the slow pace at which civil rights legislation is moving led a lot of activists, particularly the younger end of the civil rights movement, to adopt a new approach towards equality in America. Many of the younger generation felt that in order to combat violence, they have to use violence as a tactic. They have to use violence as a means of self-defense. There are two particular groups we're going to focus on who state this is kind of their tactic towards civil rights, and that is the famous Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers. Malcolm X is going to become a prominent figure who advocates for black separatism. He's initially a part of the Nation of Islam, and he has a checkered past with violence. And this is going to earn people like him the ire of more traditional civil rights leaders. So really from the outset, Malcolm X, people like that, they're going to create this separation between the traditional entrenched people like Martin Luther King Jr. and this new breed that is calling for black separatism, that's calling for breaking away, for armed resistance, violent resistance. But we'll take a quick look at these organizations and show how they're sort of appealing to dissatisfied civil rights advocates. So Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam is the first one we're going to look at. The Nation of Islam is a weird and checkered organization. I will start by saying that it is not recognized by any established Islamic body or school of Islamic jurisprudence that says they're not, by Muslims in the heart and the core of the Muslim world, the Nation of Islam is not considered to be an Islamic organization. The organization began in Detroit in the 1930s. And it's got a really weird backstory. There's a white guy, or a guy who ostensibly is probably, we would categorize him as being maybe Middle Eastern, Arabic. No one's really sure where he's originally from. And he gives about 3 or 4 different names. But he kind of is seen as this con man. He comes waltzing into Detroit, and he starts talking to black people about Islam. He says that basically African Americans need to reject the trappings of white culture. They need to, and he advocates for the total destruction of blue-eyed devils. That's something that is going to become a common recurring theme amongst the Nation of Islam. What the group is really all about, though, and what you need to identify them as being, is They're all about converting to Islam as a liberation theology. They want to convert to Islam because they see this as rejecting the white man's religion of Christianity. So they say, in order to reject white people and white culture, we need to also reject their religion. So we need to give up Christianity and convert to Islam. Now, that's glossing over or ignoring the fact that Islam was as much a foreign and disruptive force in Africa as Christianity ever was. But it's very much a liberation theology for African Americans. Their first leader is a guy by the name of Elijah Muhammad. He argued that if the white God has not delivered us, then perhaps the black God will. And he's going to be the one who's pushing for this idea of black separatism and fighting back in armed resistance against white America. And among the many converts that flocked into this group in America's northern cities was a charismatic young guy by the name of Malcolm Little. You will probably better know him by the name of Malcolm X. He adopts the X at the end of his name and replaces Little because he says Little is the name of his ancestors' slave owners. His African name has been lost to the institution of slavery, so he simply replaces it with an X. Now, the group of the Nation of Islam argues for a type, like I said, black separatism. They're pulling directly from Marcus Garvey's calls for a return to Africa and a global black model of self-sufficiency. What they want to see is the black community just simply turning away from white America, white everybody. They want to actually see basically Africans, people of African descent, move back to Africa, isolate and stay away from white communities. And if you're ever threatened by white people, then you take up arms and you fight back. That's really what their model is all about. Malcolm X routinely would come out in public, being kind of he's a little bit younger and less cautious than the actual leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad. But X is very outspoken. He comes out a lot of times and he just mocks Martin Luther King Jr. He says, look at you following this motion of nonviolent resistance. Let's see where that gets you. And Malcolm X actually calls for armed insurrection among all African Americans in the U.S. This quickly gets him put on a number of watch lists by police officers and other people in the United States, the FBI, the CIA. By 1964, Malcolm X's views are gaining a lot of traction within the dissatisfied African American community in the North. But he is abruptly kicked out of the Nation of Islam by Elijah Muhammad in 1964, ostensibly because he stepped forward after John F. Kennedy Jr., after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Malcolm X comes out in public and he says, white America's roosters are coming, or chickens are coming home to roost. In other words, what Malcolm X says is, yeah, your president got shot. You get what you pay for. You get what you deserve. And, of course, JFK was a major proponent of the civil rights movement during his presidency. And so Elijah Muhammad says, we're kicking you out of the Nation of Islam because you insulted this guy. We're not, even though we're all for black separatism and we don't trust white America, you shouldn't have stepped forward and insulted Kennedy like that after he's dead. That's in poor taste. Now, that's what they say. That's the story of why Malcolm X is kicked out. There is probably a lot more going on under the surface than we'll ever even know, but there's a lot of rumors. As a historian, I've come across a lot of literature. They say that Elijah Muhammad was cheating on his wife with pretty much every young woman in the Nation of Islam that he could come across. And that Malcolm X didn't like this. He thought that this was, number one, it's just in poor taste. He thought it was just a wrong thing to do. But number two, he also felt that this really endangered the reputation of the Nation of Islam. Really what's going to happen here is that he gets kicked out. And after he takes a pilgrimage, he takes kind of like a leave of absence. He goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca. When he's there, he realizes the Nation of Islam really has nothing to do with Islam. It has nothing to do with real, as it's practiced in the heart of the Islamic world. There's nothing about doctrine that's accepted. There's nothing that really even talks about the tenets of Islam. It's all about being black here in the United States. That's all the Nation of Islam's ever really been about. And so he comes back to the United States with a softened stance because he's educated in the peaceful ways of Islam. And he comes back and he starts talking about, yeah, the stuff I said earlier about how white America and black America can never live side by side, it's wrong. I was wrong. We can live together. We've got a ton of work to do and we've got a long way to go. But maybe there's a way that we could kind of find some common ground and start working towards that. And it's when he's giving a speech in Harlem in 1965, a disgruntled member of the Nation of Islam runs up and shoots him in the middle of his speech with a shotgun as he was speaking to his followers. And so Malcolm X would be assassinated right in the prime of his career by a disgruntled Nation of Islam follower who was angry with him. So ultimately, that brings us to the Black Panther Party. In 1966, two guys by the name of Bobby Seale and Huey Newton are going to organize the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California. This is a group that organized itself around armed defense, racial pride, and inner city renewal. The foundation of this organization was that it was important that it showed a growing anger among African Americans about their positions in American society and the failure of the mainstream civil rights movement to address that. And so this is more, they're going to pick up the slogan of Black Power from activist James Meredith, who marched throughout the South talking about Black equality and Black freedom. But really, it gets popularized by a SNCC leader by the name of Stokely Carmichael, who says, we've been saying freedom for 6 years, and we ain't got nothing. So now we're going to start saying Black Power. And that's where you get the association with the Black Power fist, and that becomes a symbol of a particular end of the civil rights movement. Well, the Black Panther Party builds on this. And what they do is that they're trying to address a lot of the failures of the mainstream civil rights movement with physical, tangible action. The group scares the heck out of the United States government. They dress in military-style apparel and fatigues. They carry assault rifles with them right there out in public. This militant image is going to really put them on the radar of J. Edgar Hoover, of the CIA, of the FBI, of all of these organizations. They are going to quickly be listed as a terrorist organization, and they're seen as the greatest threat to America's internal security. But the media hates the Black Panther Party. They are portrayed in the media the same way I was just describing, as they're seen by the law enforcement community. And the Black Panther Party, though, as a whole, did a lot for the African American community. They reached out and provided financial assistance to the most struggling members of Black society. They would hold educational meetings, provide clothing and food for the poor and the needy. They provided free healthcare clinics in African American neighborhoods. But the problem with the Black Panther Party is that a few of its members took the militant message of the organization. Really, what the message of the organization was is Black people have been oppressed for centuries. And they've been oppressed by whites who have routinely committed violence against us and attacked us in our own communities. So it is the Black Panther Party for self-defense. It's not the Black Panther Party for raising up and killing white people in their homes while they sleep for no reason other than they're white. But that's the way they start to get portrayed in the media, because a few bad apples from the Black Panther Party did go out and commit blind racial violence. There's an incident in 1967 or early 68, I can't remember. A New Jersey police officer pulls over a car with 4 Black Panther Party members in it, and he was just going to write them a speeding ticket because they were speeding. And when he walks up to the window, they just opened fire and killed the guy. And so then they became fugitives from the law. There was another incident where there was a shootout in California between Black Panther Party members and police. So they're going to be treated by the security apparatus in the United States as being domestic terrorists. The media looks at them the same way. but they did provide a lot to their community. And in a lot of ways, you might even be able to argue that whereas the mainstream civil rights movement is going to stand on sort of this idea of unity and peace and equality and all of that, a lot of it is lip service. They're talking about what they want, but they're not talking about what they're doing. The Black Panther Party is actually out there doing. But they're so heavily targeted and suppressed by the federal government that this militant end of the civil rights movement is going to be quickly sort of suppressed. The Nation of Islam will continue on, although in various forms they get a leader by the name of Louis Farrakhan, who will continue to just move forward and preach virulent anti-Semitism, where basically the Nation of Islam stopped being about black liberation theology and about hatred of Jewish people. So it's routinely been listed throughout the rest of the 20th century as a hate organization, an organization that promotes anti-Semitism and hate speech. It's been listed by the Anti-Defamation League as basically a racist and supremacist organization. Now, so you have these two ends of the civil rights movement. You've got Martin Luther King Jr. and his end that's talking about passive resistance, nonviolent resistance. And then you have the other end of it that's saying that ain't working. We're still getting killed. It's time for us to pick up weapons and defend ourselves and fight back. And so, as groups like the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther Party emerge, as I've already mentioned, younger activists, people who are a little bit more impatient, are going to gravitate away from the traditional approach of nonviolent resistance. In 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to criticize the war in Vietnam, and this creates a falling out between him and LBJ. They used to be really close allies in the fight for racial equality, but after this, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to no longer be welcome in the White House, and he loses a critical political ally in the president. There were deadly race riots in 1967 in both Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan. And this sparked King to organize what he called a poor people's encampment on the lawn of the White House. In other words, now that he's had the falling out with LBJ, he gets right here on the lawn of LBJ's house, the White House, he gets this big poor people's encampment, basically shining a light on the fact that LBJ's off abroad fighting a war in Vietnam, but he can't even take care of his own people here in the United States. It was meant to embarrass him. But he decides, Martin Luther King Jr. decides real quickly, I'm going to head down and support a garbage workers strike in Memphis, Tennessee. He's there staying at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, and he's leaned over the railing of his balcony when he's struck with a bullet from the gun of sniper James Earl Ray. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. literally sent shockwaves throughout the United States. Riots break out in over 100 cities. Any city with a even notable African American population erupts into chaos. Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, New York, Boston, every city you can think of, massive riots are taking place. Cars are getting turned over and lit on fire. Businesses are burning. Entire city blocks are burning down. All hell is literally breaking loose in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The riots lasted for about 3 weeks, and many of America's cities were badly damaged in the aftermath of his assassination. So when the dust clears and everything settles, King's dead. The major leader of the established civil rights movement is gone. The more militant ends of the movement have been labeled as domestic terrorists and suppressed by law enforcement. And the African American civil rights movement largely starts to peter out after 1968. The fight continues on a local level, and I think you can argue that it's taken different shapes. It's not really over. It's just stopped for a while, and then it picked momentum back up and took a different form at different points in America's history. But at least this particular manifestation or incantation of it is over. And after 1968, it largely fizzles out. What you tend to see is the nation is protest weary. And you'll see that African American civil rights kind of take a back burner to other civil rights organizations. It's more after 68 that you see the Mexican American rights and the Native American rights movement taking sort of a center stage. That's when they get their moment in the sun. But the problem with those movements is that, one, they're largely regional. It's hard to get somebody in Detroit, Michigan to care about the plight of Mexican Americans because they don't know any and there aren't any living in Detroit. So it's the Mexican American rights movement is really focused in the American Southwest, never really gains the traction of the mainstream African American civil rights movement. The Native American rights movement is also going to be largely overlooked, mostly because it's concurrent with something called the New Left, where you have a bunch of different groups fighting. They kind of are called professional protesters. They are people who protest everything from stop nuclear energy to stop the war in Vietnam to African American rights are not being respected to the next day they're fighting for the whales, and then the next day it's all about organic farming, and it goes on and on and on. The New Left starts to take over the protest movement, and that's where you get that hippie counterculture anti-establishment vibe. And with that happening, you get a lot of young privileged white people taking over the protest movement. That's what the New Left's all about. And so there's so many protests at this point now where you have Mexican American rights, African American rights, Native American rights, gay rights, and Stonewall are happening. The New Left is protesting every single thing they see. And with this happening, Americans finally go, we're done. I'm done with protests. I'm done with the Vietnam protests. I'm done with this protest and that protest. And I think that largely helps to explain why it sort of just fizzles out. I'm not saying that it ever goes away. These things continue well into the 1970s. And we'll even refer back to them as we continue on with our course. But nothing like the height of the civil rights movement that we just reviewed is ever going to take place again in this particular era of the 1960s or early 1970s. So, that wraps up my lecture on the civil rights era. I apologize for its length, but it is an incredibly important topic that we've been building throughout the semester. So if you have any questions, comments, demagoguery, or diatribe, feel free to send me an email. You know where to reach me. Take care.